Work. I didn't know if you had a friend.
Protocols.
Okay, we're live on YouTube.
All righty, everybody. Welcome. It's the House Energy and Digital Infrastructure Committee. It's Wednesday, April 9th, and we are going to spend the morning working on S50. We are going to kick off by hearing from Ben Edgerly Walsh from VPIRG, and then we're going to move into a laborious and careful and thoughtful review of all the testimony we've taken so far and a committee discussion. See where things stand. So then we'll introduce ourselves. We'll have everybody in the room introduce themselves, and then we'll turn it over to you for the record. So I'm Representative Kathleen James from the Bennington 4 District.
Richard Bailey from Memorial 2.
Mara Wyndham, Windsor, Bennington. And Michael Summerford, Caledonia 2. Christopher Howland, Rutland 4.
Yeah, Tori, Washington 2.
Dan Fluffner, Chittenden 13, Burlington.
Laura Spillier, Wyndham 2.
Jack Locker, Committee Assistant.
And
Greg Favor, Woodford PC.
great,
I'm Tabitha Foxwell. I'm Senator Rebecca White's intern.
great. All righty, for the record.
For the record, Ben Edgerly Walsh. I'm the Climate and Energy Program Director with the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, or VPIRG. I appreciate you having me in this morning. I'm here this morning primarily to speak to the value of amending the single plant definition, potentially as an amendment to S50, as doing so has the potential to both reduce costs and enable better land use practices. Before I get to that, however, I haven't been in here before. I don't think anyone else from VPIRG's been in front of your committee.
I think so.
So I wanted to take just a brief moment to introduce myself and the organization, if that's all right. VPIRG is the state's largest environmental and consumer protection advocacy organization. We have, more than 15,000 members and supporters in every legislative district in the state, nearly every inhabited municipality in the state. We've been around for 50 years, since 1972, and we strive to promote and protect the health of Vermont's people, environment, locally based economy. Obviously, we do that here in this building. We also do our best to lower the barriers for our members and Vermonters generally engaging here in the State House and in regulatory processes that are very important, but often fairly opaque and complex and hard for Vermonters to access. Personally, I've been running VPIRG's climate and energy program since 2012. So I've been around for most of the provisions and programs that are sort of relevant to this bill and this discussion. The expansion of the standard offer in 2012, Vermont's original and updated renewable energy standards, and the net metering law that was passed in 2014 that still governs net metering today. So I want to briefly cover at the end of my testimony our support for S50 itself, the sort of underlying bill, but mostly wanted to focus on the single plant provision in Section 3 of H394, because I think that really could bring a lot of value to a bill that we think is already a good step in the right direction, but could do even more to streamline things for renewables. I wanted to start by quickly outlining just a little bit of context from where I sit, where how VPIRG thinks about these things. First, by outlining the small number of ways that virtually all renewables 5 megawatts and under, which is to say renewables qualifying for tier 2 of Vermont's renewable energy standard, which is the only requirement to build renewables in Vermont. The small number of ways that those kinds of plants can get built. So obviously you've got net metering, standard offer, and then PPAs, or sort of I would clump with that projects that are actually constructed and owned by utilities themselves. So first, net metering, obviously that's the program that gets that allows Vermonters, Vermont businesses, et cetera, to build renewables for their own use. That goes up to 500 kilowatts, and sort of is from the very smallest rooftop system up to that. The standard offer, which you've heard a lot about in recent days. So briefly, this was created in 2009. That was a moment in the history of energy in Vermont where there were literally no renewable solar plants of a megawatt or larger in size. I don't know exactly what the largest solar plant at that time was, but I suspect it was probably net metering system in the low 150 kilowatt, maybe a small utility system in the several hundred kilowatt range. So the rates were originally set in statute in that first 2009 law, and that really was done to get the ball rolling on this sort of idea of maybe we could build solar that's larger than 100 kilowatts, 200 kilowatts. Maybe there's actually more to do here. It's always had a size cap of 2.2 megawatts, and the vast majority of the capacity built under the standard offer has been a megawatt or larger in size. Most of it solar, most of the solar around that 2.2 megawatt size. It was originally 50 megawatts of capacity, and then in 2012, in that law that I mentioned, 77.5 megawatts was added to it. That seems like a sort of random number, but basically how that happened was it was 5 megawatts a year for a few years, then 7.5 for a few years, then 10 for a few years. And that wrapped up in 2022. That law also initiated the reverse auction. So instead of setting a statute, that's the PUC essentially put this out for bid, get the lowest possible bids, and those are the ones that are going to get built. That allowed solar, in particular, other renewables as well, to come to Vermont ratepayers at a lower cost as costs for those projects dropped over time. And frankly, it was that initial 50 megawatt slug that was in the 2009 law that really, again, got the ball rolling on that and got a whole bunch of projects in that size range built it here in Vermont, started to build the industry and enabled those projects to really come down in cost, that is. Finally, you've got utility PPAs or utility constructed projects. So that's a power purchase agreement with a solar developer, other type of energy developer, very similar to the standard offer. They'll solicit bids, they'll take usually the lowest or best bid from their perspective, really trying to save ratepayers money by finding the least cost project available. Those tend to be large projects. Some of them, a number of them have been in that sort of 5 megawatts, that maximum size under tier 2, because then you're maximizing the economies of scale and minimizing the costs.
Ben, you have written testimony, right?
I do. I meant to start by apologizing for not getting it to you in advance. I'll be able to submit it within a few minutes of wrapping it.
Okay. Can I drop back for 1 sec? Net metering, and I think one thing that's been challenging for us as a new committee is just wrapping our head around all the different projects and permitting pathways and how the rates and how they all intersect. So net metering, just remind me that we originally set those rates in statute when?
I believe
Or set up the program, I
was
guess.
created in, I want to say 1997 or 1999. It was the late 90s. It was originally, I believe, just for farms and only for very small projects. It was expanded periodically through the 2000s, and that really culminated in the 2014 law. There had been almost annual amendments to expansions of net metering for several years leading up to the 2014 law. And that 2014 law handed that authority over to the PUC because the legislature at that point basically made the determination that it really wasn't tenable any longer for the legislature itself to have to continually go back and tweak the program year after year.
So since 2014, and that actually sounds like it was a great decision. So since 2014, the net metering rulemaking rate setting has been handled by the PUC by rule.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and the net metering, you said size capacity. You mentioned it goes up to some number of megawatts.
500 kilowatt, half megawatt. Yeah.
500 kilowatts. Okay, and then beyond that, net metering it doesn't apply, right? So net metering is available to projects under 500 kilowatts.
Yeah, up to and including 500 kilowatts. There have been a few exceptions over the years. There were some larger landfill projects allowed for a time. I believe that was before the 2014 law. So for instance, the Brattleboro landfill has a 5 megawatt system on it. And I'm sorry, I was going to say there's an exception for schools, but does not allow for larger systems, but you could have a couple of 500 kilowatt systems serving the same school district, for instance.
So does net metering, do the rates, and I know the PUC sets the rates, and we've talked about that, and I know they have different categories, I believe, for the rates. But if you are under that size, do you automatically get these reduced rates? It's not an extra hoop you have to, right? So if you're 500 kilowatts or less, then you are a qualified net metering project and you will get the current rates.
Yes, if you submit the CPG as
Right.
What I'm trying to say is you can build smaller, you could do a PPA for a small project. There's nothing stopping someone from building a smaller facility on 500 kilowatts or under and not being net metering. That's incredibly rare, because if you're building a utility PPA, they typically would want the cost savings of a larger project. So it's hypothetically possible to build a smaller array and not be net metering, but in practical terms, smaller arrays are built because the net metering program exists and has a fixed rate of compensation that's predictable and makes the numbers pencil.
Okay, and then we standard offer, we learned yesterday, and we already knew that the program is basically sunsetting and there's still some project contracts in the works, basically.
Yes, I actually reviewed the numbers last night. So the total authorized in statute is 127.5 megawatts. There, at least at the Standard Offer Facilitator's website, it looks like there's about 9 megawatts that currently is not assigned to a project that is authorized to be constructed. And then about another 16 that's been authorized for specific projects, but those haven't actually gone online yet. So maybe about 20% of the total capacity hasn't been constructed. But most of that's already locked into specific projects and specific locations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rep Clutter, so I didn't see you. I'm taking notes, guys. I'm sorry.
That was impressive, actually.
Thank you.
Peripheral vision. So on the subject of people choosing to put smaller projects into the net metering program because the rates are predictable and at a rate that makes the numbers work, right? Do you have a sense for how it would affect those projects if instead of paying above market for excess power that goes into the grid, it was market?
It would certainly make the payback period substantially longer. That's not something that I've put an enormous amount of thought to in recent days. I was actually, I will preview a little bit about later in my testimony. My suggestion here, and I will get to this, but my suggestion here is essentially to not have the new single plane definition apply to net metering in the standard offer, just to avoid any of the problems that you heard about yesterday from Mr. Merritt from the PUC. But to reiterate, in response to your question directly, it would make the payback period longer, and it would contribute to what we've seen generally in net metering, which is it slowly declining over time. Fewer and fewer people doing it. There's still plenty happening, but it's a lot less than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And generally speaking, we've seen annualized declines for a while.
And the individual net metering program rates, it lives on just with declining reimbursement rates or compensation rates as we've seen, but it's the group net metering portion of it specifically that we knocked out with the rest.
Yes, offsite group net metering is where there are some limited cases where it's still allowed. If you have 2 adjoining parcels, that is an instance where you could still build an array that you have both of those parcels having off acres. But generally speaking, group net metering as it's existed to date is no longer allowed, except for affordable housing developers who can do it through the end of this calendar year, and then it goes away entirely.
Okay, sorry, we dragged way off. Okay, go ahead.
One quick question. If you are an off taker, if you have a house with a bunch of land and you want to build a net metering array and you take some of that power for your house, you can have off takers for the rest of it. Is that true? You can sell the rest of it.
If you have a bunch of neighbors who directly adjoin your parcel that would like to take the power,
So it has to be a joint
if it's somebody 2 doors down, then they can't.
Oh, okay. So
That would be considered offsite vertical net metering, even if it's like a large array on a roof.
Yeah.
And you want to give some to your brother a couple towns over, that's not allowed.
okay, thanks.
All right, back to, okay.
Can you pyramid them? If the next door neighbor takes it and he's a member, can the next door neighbor to that be a member?
That is not allowed. In
No, so it has to be directly adjacent. It's not, you can't cascade them or.
that, yes, that's correct. That's my understanding.
All right, back to your testimony. Sorry.
No. I've been watching your hearings from afar and anticipated plenty of good. Okay, so let me actually get to the single plan definition. How is all of what I just said and what we just discussed relevant to this question of how plants are defined in 8002? So I want to start by just saying I agree with the characterization that this what definition was added in 2009. I went back and pulled up the bill that passed in 2009. It's literally the same bill that created the standard offer in the first place. And that essentially that was done to ensure that larger plants wouldn't be artificially split up to gain advantage under the standard offer. In particular, back then, with those rates being set in statute, that could turn into just essentially a profit center for one greedy developer. So that certainly I think was the original intent. As the standard offer moved to a reverse auction and net metering grew and the sort of maximum size for net metering projects grew, I think you could reasonably assume that there was a value, very similar value that extended into the net metering program. So you couldn't have, somebody build a 2 megawatt plant and go, actually it's 4 or 500s. So really it's those two programs that are the ones that have some sort of financial benefit that you could imagine someone wanting to take advantage of the sort of a single plant definition that wasn't sufficiently stringent as a loophole to build a larger plant, artificially break it up and benefit from the thresholds and caps on those programs, or avoid the thresholds and caps on those programs, I should say. The last piece of the puzzle, though, from our perspective, is actually the state's renewable energy standard, which again didn't exist when this came into effect, was passed in 2015, went into effect in 2017, and then was updated last year by the legislature. So I'm going to skip over most of the details, but the relevant point for this conversation is that the 2015 standard offer basically amounted to, along with some other things for like total renewables, the new renewables in Vermont, 5 megawatts or under, that category, tier 2 of the renewable energy standard, it needed about 25 megawatts a year of that kind of construction to have utilities meet their requirements. It wasn't literally written into statute 25 megawatts, but if you do the math from the percentages, it's about that. And then you have to look at net metering and the standard offer. And so you're trying to fill this 25 megawatt bucket every year. You have net metering actually at that time, at the passage of that law, running at more than 25 megawatts a year. And that actually continued for a while. And then you have the standard offer ramping up from 5 megawatts up to 10 megawatts a year as that law is implemented. And so you have this 25 megawatt a year bucket that the utilities are required to fill, and it's basically being filled up entirely by net metering and standard offer. The utilities were definitely building some of their own projects. I haven't gone back to ask them or, dig up CBG filings and whatnot, or IRPs, but I imagine some of that was the timing of construction. There's a lag with standard offer, but regardless, a little bit of utility construction was happening, PPAs were happening, but mostly that 25 megawatts a year was filled with the standard offer and net metering. And so if you think about the single plant definition as something intended to avoid, let's say, gaming either of those programs, and those two programs were basically all, within a rounding error of all of the construction in the size category that's happening in the state, there really wasn't a need to revisit this definition in that sort of post renewable energy standard era. That changed very recently for two reasons. One, as you've heard, the standard offer's last capacity addition of 10 megawatts was in 2022. There's a lag time between when bids come in and the PUC accepts them and when these plants are actually constructed. So if nothing had happened to the renewable energy standard, I'd imagine that this session, or maybe in the next few sessions, something like this conversation would be happening anyway, because the standard offer would be entirely gone. That metering probably would be continuing to shrink, and you'd have that 25 megawatt a year bucket no longer being filled by those two programs. You'd have probably less than 25 megawatts a year of net metering, no standard offer, and that 25 megawatts is going to would be growing slightly as load grows in this state. And so then you'd be filling the gap between whatever net metering is providing and what the renewable energy standard is requiring with projects, probably mostly PPAs from the utilities, that just where the rationale for the single plant definition as it exists in statute today doesn't apply, because there's not a state endorsed program providing a preferential for that piece of net metering. The other thing that happened, of course, is the renewable energy standard did change. The requirement for tier 2 was roughly doubled. And that it was done in a sort of a shorter time frame than the original renewable energy standards time frame. And so what that means is by the late part of this decade, every year, it's not going to be 25 megawatts, it's going to be 50, maybe even 60 megawatts a year that needs to get built. I'm using this in the megawatt capacity numbers I'm using are solar. That's almost all the capacity that's being added in this category. And so now with the new renewable energy standard, no standard offer, shrinking net metering, you've got a situation where you don't have a 25 megawatt bucket being filled up entirely by these two programs. You've got let's call it a 50 megawatt bucket in the next few years being filled up less than half by net metering. And so now the non-net metering, non-standard offer capacity that needs to be added every year is 25 megawatts, maybe even 35 megawatts. And that's all capacity that is going to be constructed in ways that don't have anything to do with the financial arrangements net metering and the standard offer layout. And so for those megawatts, for those plants, the value of the single plant definition as it exists today, which again is primarily about avoiding anyone gaming either of those two state sanctioned programs, just isn't applicable. And so if there are, and I'll get into this, and I recognize we're running a little bit.
We're actually not really running that far behind, because I want to make sure you have a chance to present your testimony, and at 9:30 we're moving into committee discussion. So we don't have another witness, in other words, waiting on YouTube. So I think we have a little bit more time.
Okay. Well, I will be respectful of your time, but I appreciate knowing I don't need to rush or cut out pieces of my testimony.
Can I ask a question before you go on, since you're short right here? Does the current situation effectively require utilities to build net metering systems or renewable energy system generation systems in order to satisfy the threshold you're talking about, the tier 2?
Not net metering systems, but in practical terms, it requires them to build, get built, or contract with plants that are being built. In that sort of the order of magnitude that I'm talking about, that's sort of like 50-ish megawatts a year. They need to make sure that they have that capacity to satisfy the requirements of the renewable energy standard. There are a few ways they can get it done, but essentially, yes.
So if they contract with a developer, that would be for a power purchase agreement and not for a program. So it would be basically market, whatever the market is.
Yes, exactly. You could also theoretically have developers just independently go and build projects and try to sell the RECs to utilities, but mostly everyone expects it to primarily be PPAs.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Absolutely. So I want to get back to the beginning of my testimony. In our view, there are two reasons to amend the single plant definition. Now that there's actually meaningful capacity that's needed to be constructed, that's not going to be net metering or standard offer. First, doing so will eliminate unnecessary costs for some plants, which will, because these are all competitive bidding processes, lead to modest benefits, financial benefits to ratepayers. Second, such a change also opens the possibility of co-locating facilities where it makes sense from a grid or land use standpoint. That isn't going to be the case in all or even most of the instances we're talking about here, but there certainly are some places where having facilities, solar plants, be able to take advantage of existing infrastructure, existing screening, grid capacity, et cetera, makes sense. To sort of say that the other way, it doesn't really make sense to either force these plants to all exist separately in different locations when there is a good value potentially in co-locating them, or require them to add additional costs that wouldn't be necessary from an engineering or technical standpoint, merely to meet a statutory definition that was originally intended for specific programs and not utility facilities.
Can you go back to the first point again? And just take that again.
The cost piece.
Mm.
Yes. So let me use an example. So if you have, say, 2.2 megawatt standard offer project, and I don't have a particular plan in mind, this is purely a hypothetical, but this sort of thing certainly exists in Vermont. So you got a 2.2 megawatt plant that's in a large gravel pit, you could add another 4 or 5 megawatts to that. Right now, to do that, you would probably, and I'm hedging a little bit because as the PUC said, this is really a case-by-case call on their part, that it's really, there's no clear line, it's every single one has to figure it out individually. You would probably, to build that new plant, need to construct a new road, put up potentially new or different poles and wires. There are a number of things that it might be, but because the definition talks about shared infrastructure and you need to avoid that to not be considered the same plant, you probably would need to add costs and you've heard specific examples of specific projects where this has happened by building redundant or otherwise unnecessary equipment or infrastructure, which would kind of necessarily mean that the per kilowatt hour rate that the utilities would end up getting would be not, night and day, but a little bit higher.
Great, thanks.
I follow up on that. In addition to a 2.2 megawatt plant, which is under standard offer, previously built under standard offer, would be not under standard offer, right? Because that's not available. So it would be a power purchase agreement.
The new
addition. So regardless of how it's hooked up, whether it uses the same road and the same full suppliers and everything, it would need a new interconnection probably because it would need a larger interconnection, right?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, that's sort of the point is like, of course, the utilities are going to have to do developers are going to have to do what they need to do to actually get a thing built.
Yeah.
But from our perspective, unless there's a really good policy reason to require additional infrastructure that is not necessary from an engineering standpoint, doing so simply adds costs without a benefit.
Right, and disturbs them and all that. I get all that. I guess what I'm trying to get at is why would this single plant issue apply when the program that is available is different, right? So, they can't expand the standard offer price because that's a previous contract, previous project, and that's not available anymore. So it would have to be a new way of selling the power.
Well, that's a great question. There may be other specific instances where what you're saying would be true. But the primary one that I would raise is the capacity limit or the plant capacity limit under tier 2 of the renewable energy standard. So take the standard offer out of it entirely. If you had let's say a 2 megawatt utility, purchase PPA, that was qualifying for tier 2 of the renewable energy standard, and they wanted to get another 4 megawatts built nearby, reducing the cost a little bit by sharing some of the infrastructure. 2 plus 4 is 6. And this is the same plant definition that it's in the same part of Title 30 that covers the renewable energy standard. So for the 5 megawatt limit to be met, you couldn't actually do that. You would have to have them be seen as separate plants.
Oh, okay.
There is an ISO New England test in terms of what constitutes a single, I'm not sure if they use the term plant, and that's up to ISO New England, but for our purposes, Vermont law says tier 2 can only be up to 5 megawatts. If you're building 2 projects next to each other, either at the same time or at different times, that wind up getting above that 5 megawatts line, then you're not going to be, the utilities aren't going to be allowed to count that for tier 2.
And the 5 megawatt is an ISO.
Yeah, it comes from, it comes originally from ISO New England, and basically above 5 megawatts, they have more direct regulation over plants. And so Vermont adopted that same line in the 2015 law for tier 2. I'll leave it there.
So we have to build 50 or 60 megawatts of tier 2 in the coming years at 5 megawatts
A piece.
max.
Yes, up to, but not exceeding 5 megawatts a pop.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Okay, I'm getting close to the end, and then I will touch on the underlying bill as well. So yesterday you heard from Mr. Marin from the PUC that, and this is a quote, we would rather see larger facilities built provided that they meet the standards of Section 248, because those will have more attractive prices for ratepayers. They'll be more economical. Well, Mr. Marin was raising concerns about modifying this definition. From our perspective, that sentiment is exactly why you should modify the definition. The economies of scale are real, savings from shared infrastructure are real, and an environment in which utilities are soliciting the best, lowest bids for their ratepayers, adding unnecessary costs, just doesn't make sense from our perspective. There are cases where we might want to add necessary costs. There are all sorts of things that the state does to oversee these projects that increase the costs, and many of them are very valuable. But if there are instances where there isn't a really clear policy value to them, then saving the money for ratepayers makes all the sense in the world to us. I also wanted to speak to 1 or 2 other things Mr. Marin mentioned yesterday briefly. First, the question of whether or not the single plant definition prevents projects from being built. There's a couple of quick points I want to make there. One, there's whether projects are prohibited or even whether they're rejected in the Section 248 process isn't the same as whether this is stopping some things from happening. Those are overlapping things, certainly. A rejection of a CPG is one way to stop something from happening, but it's entirely reasonable to assume, and I've certainly heard anecdotally, that there are developers or landowners either walking away from projects when they understand the complexity of what they might have to go through here, or just not getting them rolling in the first place because they understand they're going to have to, go through this single plant thing, build an extra roof, whatever it is, based on conversations with attorneys, and they just never propose it in the first place. And the PUC wouldn't necessarily know about that, but that would still mean a project would be built. The other piece there is, if there's additional cost, even if you're not stopping the thing, there is a downside. And then lastly, and then I'll move on from Mr. Marin's testimony, he spoke to a 2-pronged analysis. And again, this is a quote. First, you have to be part of the same project. Second, you have to share infrastructure and equipment. The reality is that that's a reasonable way to sort of group or bucket, categorize the test or analysis that they do. But the reality is there's far more than 2 factors at play in the case-by-case judgment the PUC makes when determining whether something's a single plant. If you look at the definition, it raises common equipment and infrastructure, citing 3 examples of those, common ownership, contiguity and time of construction, and proximity of facilities to each other. And that's in addition to them being part of the same project. So there's at least 5 things that the PUC is looking at there. And again, that's not to say that this is insurmountable. Like, there are plenty of projects that have gone through this and gotten built, but that's additional time, additional resources, additional hassle, additional money that ratepayers are going to have to pay. Just 1 second. Yeah, so just to sort of wrap up my points on this potential part of the bill, thing that you can add to the bill. We're talking about a world in which we've got a relatively small and shrinking amount of standard offer, a shrinking net metering program. And yesterday, Mr. Marin, as I heard his testimony, was primarily raising concerns about how changing the plant definition could impact those 2 programs, the capacity that's coming to the state under those 2 programs. I think it was actually a pretty simple, and I previewed this a little bit earlier, fix to this that allows you to get the benefits of changing the definition without any of the risks on the standard offer and the net metering, which is to simply keep the current definition for standard offer and net metering projects and have a sub definition that says for everything else, everything that's not under one of those 2 projects, here's the new definition. I think the definition that Renewable Energy Vermont brought the other day makes a lot of sense. And that, again, would allow the standard offer and net metering that's still moving forward to have the benefit of the single plant definition as it has existed for the last 16 years. And projects that don't fall into those 2 categories to have a slightly simpler, slightly less expensive process. And that, to us, makes a lot of sense.
Rep. Kutner?
Would it be slightly safer to say that net metering, standard offer, and other future above market programs retain the rule and everything else doesn't, just in case there are future programs and we don't want to mess with the statute again?
Yes, I think that would be entirely reasonable. It might be a little bit tricky to write it to capture all hypotheticals. I would also say I actually don't, and I've been just skipping past this point because it's not in my view really relevant, especially if the committee takes the suggestion of sort of bifurcating the definition. But I actually don't agree with the characterization. I'm not saying it's coming from you. Lots of people have implied it, that the standard offer is an above market program. It's certainly a state sanctioned program. It was absolutely above market when it was created. But if you actually look at the prices that standard offer projects have been paying over the last 5 or 6, they are generally at or even a little bit lower than most PPAs. So if you wrote a definition like that and said above market programs, you get this definition, I'm not sure whether an attorney would look at that and say, oh, the standard offer program is definitely above market program.
I think okay. Thank you.
That's a longer, too long to say of saying that's perfectly reasonable.
She can fix it.
I think can certainly say net metering, standard offer, and what you said.
Yeah.
And then you've got your bases covered.
Yeah. Okay.
But
Rep. Campbell?
effectively, there's still a limit though. There's a 5 megawatt limit. So we would still want a single plant definition to bump up against that limit.
I would argue you don't, because Renewable Energy Vermont suggested a 10 megawatt limit for a single site. I forget exactly the language they proposed, but in that scenario, you could have a 2 and a 5, or a 4 and a 4, or a 5 and a 5, still be not considered a single plant, still be eligible for tier 2 of the renewable energy standard, and still benefit from the cost savings of co-locating. But you'd avoid the scenario where you're having 3, 4, 5, 10, 85, obviously that would never happen, but a whole bunch of 5 megawatts co-located. There are reasonable land use reasons that you wouldn't necessarily want that, but having a hard line at 5 megawatts from our perspective doesn't make sense.
But it would have to somehow pass muster with ISO 2. It would have to be 2 fives in order, and actually, as you're saying, as I'm remembering, Bren's testimony, that where it seemed to me that we were effectively saying, all right, well, the limit is now 10 megawatts. So at that rate, then ISO would have to be convinced this is 2 fives, not 110.
Yeah, so ISO has its own process. There's a flow chart that they've created that I can share with the committee. I'm not prepared in this moment to walk through it, but essentially it's like if this, like one of those yes, no kind of charts that determines whether something is one facility or more than one facility. And it certainly allows for the possibility of one facility being built and then later another facility being built on the same site, and the second facility not being sort of plunked with added capacity, and having 2 projects that are under 5 megawatts with a total capacity of more than 5 megawatts that aren't considered a single plant for their purposes.
The project separated in time.
That is part of the test that ISO New England looks at.
Okay. So with this, what we're talking about is potentially allowing further development of an already developed site.
Yes, that is what we are most envisioning. I would say that could be part of statute. It's certainly nodded to now. I think if you were interested in contemplating that, I'd suggest a firmer, like, set amount of months, for instance. That you'd be looking at, as opposed to just a general like statement.
Right.
Look at when they're built, and then you're back in the sort of ambiguity world that really adds the time cost.
Right.
Yeah, this is interesting. I'm interested in the sort of compromise path what I think sounds like a compromise path you're proposing, because it's interesting to be in this committee and talk to folks that are such policy experts, and I always try to back it back up to the 100,000 foot level. I think probably a lot of us agree that the PUC's concerns yesterday about gaming the system and or lacking the ability to provide thoughtful sort of comprehensive oversight, right, of these sites as they're being developed is legit. And at the same time, I keep in my mind going back to the photos we're seeing of the most likely places where this is going to happen, and thinking, yeah, that is where we want more solar. That's where we want to encourage more solar. That's where we don't want to make it harder to put up more solar. And so if what you're suggesting could provide some sort of compromise path forward, I, for one, am very interested. Yeah, David.
Being new at all this all seems very, very complicated. Is there any way we can just streamline all this stuff so that you just say solar will be solar, these projects will be, power will be bought at market rate? Is that, and then the investors or whatever figure it out what it takes to make it work?
That is essentially what the renewable energy standard does. It sets a requirement for the utilities to get a certain amount of their energy from renewables, and it's up to them. Again, they're setting aside standard offer and net metering to go out and figure out the cheapest possible way to get that stuff in their ratepayers' hands. And often it's a PPA. That 5 megawatt limit is important in terms of it being an in-state definition. And so I think, or at least from my perspective, yes, the context is complicated, but what our goal as an organization is in fact to just make it simpler so that there are fewer hoops to jump through, unless there are really good reasons for those. Could I speak briefly to and this is one paragraph,
Yeah.
the S50 part.
That.
Which part?
That's 50, the underlying bill.
That's it.
That's why I said, oh, that.
Totally
What?
looked
Yeah.
15 to 25.
Yeah, the 25 is the new 15.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you said it right. So I'm sure it won't be a shock to the committee to say that we're supportive of this. We see this common sense streamlining for backyard solar arrays. As you've heard from others, solar panel technology has evolved dramatically, while reasonable electric usage has increased significantly as heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, EVs have become more and more common. So you've got a 25 kilowatt array sitting in essentially the same footprint that a 15 kilowatt used to, back when 15 kilowatts was the put in statute as the registration line. So it makes a lot of sense. I will note that we understand and agree with the concerns that the PUC's raised about the complexity of having the setbacks be the same as the local setbacks in every instance. This is trying to be the simplest possible way to build solar, and that's an additional layer of complexity. So I just wanted to, I know you've heard about that, and I wanted to note it. Let me just wrap, and then happy to stick around for other questions if you have any more. By saying, I really appreciate you taking the time to hear from us. I also want to say, I know you don't have time to hear from everyone under the sun, and wanted to highlight that your committee has gotten letters from a number of other environmental organizations, the Nature Conservancy, Vermont Conservation Voters, the NRC, I believe some others, in particular on the single plant issue. And I wanted to just highlight that is, I think especially, it's because of the ratepayer piece, it's also because of the land use piece, that it just makes sense to remove barriers to co-locating solar facilities when doing so has the potential to minimize disturbances, minimize any of the kind of land use concerns that come from any type of development, renewable or otherwise. So thank you for your consideration. I hope you'll move forward with all these pieces.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah.
Why don't we, I have an idea.
You're in a sentence then. Yes.
Yeah. Why don't we take a break? And Ellen, thank you for your patience. We set aside the whole morning for this, so we could take a 10-minute break and then